Good morning, everyone. I'm Susie Stern, and as a JDC board member and chair of the program committee, I want to thank you for joining the Jewish Democratic Council of America's emergency briefing, Crisis in Israel and the U.S. Response. This has been a horrific, traumatizing week for Jews around the world, as we have witnessed the barbaric images, videos, and stories out of Israel of Hamas brutally murdering more than 1,000 people, including entire families, injuring thousands, and holding more than 100 hostage, including women and children and the elderly. More Jews were murdered on October 7 than on any other day since the Holocaust. And as Jews and as Americans, our hearts are broken. Like so many of you, at JDC, when tragedy strikes, we take action to support each other, to support Israel, and to do something, anything, to translate the pain and the hopelessness that we may be feeling into action. That is why we convened this emergency briefing on the crisis in Israel and how the U.S. can and should respond, from President Biden to Congress to each of us and our communities. Today, we are joined by Israel expert Michael Koplow, Chief Policy Officer at the Israel Policy Forum. Michael also serves as a Senior Research Fellow of the Kogod Research Center at the Sholem Hartman Institute of North America, and previously served as the founding program director of the Israel Institute. Moderating the conversation is JDCA CEO Haley Soifer, who will give us an overview of JDCA's response as well as what we can expect from the U.S. government. Haley will speak with Michael, and then we effectively will hear from all of you. We are taking audience questions and we'll do our best to get to all of them. So please email your questions to info@jewisdems.org. With that, I will turn things over to Haley. Thank you.
Thanks, Susie. And thanks to the hundreds of you for being here today. We at JDCA are grieving, mourning, and still in a state of shock following Israel's immeasurable losses at the hands of Hamas. We are also grateful for the unwavering American support of Israel in this moment of crisis, and we are deeply concerned about what comes next. In this difficult moment, we're grateful to convene as a community and with experts to discuss our collective response and the response of the U.S. government. But first, some reflections about the devastation. Israel is still identifying its dead and missing, including the 150 men, women, and children being held hostage in Gaza. We at JDCA stand with Israelis and share their pain following the largest single-day massacre of Jewish people since the Holocaust. Yesterday, President Biden affirmed that this attack has brought to the surface painful memories and the scars left by a millennia of anti-Semitism and genocide of the Jewish people. He's absolutely right, and we are in pain. On social media and the news, we continue to bear witness to the carnage and horror of mass murder, of young people dancing in a desert, then gunned down as they ran for their lives, of parents doing everything they could to protect their children, of whole families massacred and burned alive, of 40 babies killed in cold blood, of rape, assault, decapitation, and the unconscionable parading of the dead, and of course, the approximately 150 men, women, children, including disabled and the elderly, a Holocaust survivor, ripped from their families and their country and taken into Gaza to be used as human shields and bargaining chips by a terrorist organization. We fear for their safety and the well-being of each and every hostage, military, civilians, Israelis, Americans, and others, whose fate is unknown to their families, to their governments, and to all of us. There is no justification for this unmitigated campaign of terror, which the Biden administration has unequivocally condemned and accurately likened to the tactics used by ISIS. Democratic leaders from President Biden to Senate Majority Leader Schumer and House Democratic Leader Jeffries have been united in their support of Israel and its right to self-defense. They've issued numerous statements of support, and the president has followed his words with actions. At President Biden's direction, the U.S. military has enhanced its force posture in the region to strengthen deterrence, including the movement of now 2 U.S. carrier strike groups in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Biden administration has also started sending Israel ammunition and needed interceptors for the Iron Dome missile defense system. President Biden has repeatedly spoken with Prime Minister Netanyahu about additional capabilities that Israel will need, and he pledged that American planes will be landing in Israel with additional supplies in the days ahead. Congress also needs to take action. First and foremost, House Republicans must elect a speaker so the House can function, passing pending bipartisan resolutions offering U.S. support of Israel and emergency supplemental aid to Israel and possibly Ukraine. In addition, the Senate should work to confirm the military and diplomatic professionals who hold key posts that serve America and Israel's shared defense interests. The Senate should immediately confirm Jack Lew, an eminently qualified nominee, to be our next ambassador to Israel. And Senate Republicans must end Senator Tuberville's senseless 6-month hold on hundreds of military promotions and fill vital national security positions. Congress must ensure that the United States is fully prepared with every possible resource, military and diplomatic, to support Israel at this time. JDCA has been calling for such actions, and we encourage you to join us. In the chat, you can take action today. Write your senator urging the immediate confirmation of Jack Lew as the next U.S. ambassador to Israel, and we'll have additional calls to action in the days ahead. To help us understand and process recent events, I'm thrilled to bring in Israel Policy Forum's Chief Policy Officer, Michael Koplow. Michael, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Haley.
We'll start with breaking news. In the past hour, we've seen reports that Israel has in fact formed a unity government 5 days into this crisis, which seemed inconceivable less than a week ago. What will this government look like? Who has what authority? And what does it mean in practice, including as it relates to formulating the Israeli response to this crisis?
The unity government that has been formed is one in which Benny Gantz and his party agreed to join the government for the purposes of fighting the war. And the structure that they have agreed upon is that there is going to be a 3-person war cabinet. Those 3 people are Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Benny Gantz, and Yoav Gallant, who is a defense minister. They have also left a 4th spot open, according to reports, for Yair Lapid, in case he wants to join as well. And then there are 2 observers to this war cabinet, Ron Dermer and Gadi Eisenkot. Gadi Eisenkot is a former IDF chief of staff who is in Benny Gantz's party. And the deal is that all decisions about the war are going to be made by this war cabinet and not by the larger government. In addition, there has been an agreement that while the war is going on, the Knesset is not going to take up any new legislation or act on any legislation, and the government is not going to adopt any new regulations that are not directly related to the war. And so this is how they got around the difficulty that had existed of the prime minister wanting to keep his current 64-seat coalition and Benny Gantz and other folks in the opposition being afraid that if they joined the government, that they would not only be joining for the war effort, but would also be lending a hand to some of the measures that they have opposed over the past 10 months. So it is going to be a very narrow war-focused government.
Okay, well, thank you. Taking a step back, since Israel's withdrawal from Gaza in 2005 and Hamas's takeover in 2006, there have been numerous conflicts between Israel and Hamas. We've seen them in recent years, including 11 days in 2021. Talk about how this attack and this multifaceted terrorist campaign is different from any that Israel's ever experienced and how it happened.
This is different in a number of ways. First of all, as was noted up top, more Israelis were killed on Saturday than on any other day in history. More Jews were killed on Saturday than any day since the Holocaust. And of course there are the approximately 150 Israelis who were abducted and who are being held hostage inside of Gaza by Hamas. So in terms of the scope, in terms of the ferocity, this is truly unprecedented. Second, when we talk about Israeli casualties in the past, they've largely been military casualties. So when we look at the Yom Kippur War and a day that had that before Saturday, the day that had the most Israelis who were killed in one day, that was soldiers. These were not soldiers. These are Israeli civilians. And so there, again, there is a shocking element and a tragic element to this that has been absent from Israel in any previous time. Second, there's a shock element to this in that nobody expected this type of attack from Hamas. There has been a consensus in the Israeli political and security and analyst community, and I should say that consensus largely extended to non-Israelis who are also part of the analyst community, including me, that Hamas, which obviously was and is a terrorist group, was not interested in launching an all-out war with Israel on the Gaza border because Hamas has to rule Gaza. And the Israeli policy, not just with this government, but with the previous government as well, has been to open up the economy in Gaza and alleviate some of the pressure on the theory that if ordinary Palestinians in Gaza saw their lives improved and had something to lose, that would make it even more difficult for Hamas to do something that would end all of that overnight. And so nobody was expecting an attack like this from Hamas. People, I think expected periods of rockets, as we've seen, but not something like this. And third, there was a determination that even if Hamas wanted to cross over the Gaza border, that border was secure. And Israel has spent billions of dollars over the last decade on the Gaza border, and it was in two ways. One was constructing a barrier above ground, and that is a series of two fences, one right on the Israel-Gaza border on the internationally recognized Green Line, and one about 100 yards into Gaza, two fences. And those fences were not heavily manned, but they were very heavily equipped with things like sensors and early warning detection systems, and some automatic weapons that were mounted and remote controlled, a series of drones that was patrolling the Gaza border. And so there was this idea that the Gaza border was secure because of all of this heavy reliance on technology, and that if any Hamas fighters tried to infiltrate, on the assumption that it would be, in groups of small groups, 1, 2, 5, that they would be detected immediately. The second thing that Israel did was spend billions of dollars building a subterranean wall that goes over 100 meters down. That was done in response to the previous threat from Gaza, which was tunnels. People will remember that a decade ago, the big concern were Hamas fighters using tunnels to come out and attack Israelis and to capture Israelis and bring them back. And Israel's response was to spend billions of dollars building this underground barrier, and that was meant to prevent Hamas infiltrations. And so I think for all of these reasons, this came as a huge surprise to Israelis, not just because of the scale of it, but because they were not expecting this type of attack from Hamas in any way, shape, or form.
Mm-hmm. There's been a lot of speculation about Iran's role. For decades, Hamas has been armed, funded, and supported by Iran, the world's largest state sponsor of terror. What role, if any, does Iran appear to have played in this attack? And how do you respond to those, specifically Republicans, falsely claiming that the $6 billion in unfrozen Iranian funds somehow contributed to this crisis?
Iran is, as you note, the world's largest sponsor of state-sponsored terrorism. And Hamas, for years, has been funded by Iran, trained by Iran, equipped by Iran. We've seen over the past few months that Hamas leadership and Islamic Jihad leadership and Hezbollah leadership have all been meeting openly with Iranian officials. And I think it's certainly safe to assume that some of those meetings were indeed dedicated to planning or discussions about the attack we saw on Saturday. So far, there isn't any evidence that Iran was directly involved in the attack itself, and it's also possible that Iran knew that something like this was going to happen, but was not directing it down to the last detail behind the scenes. But there's no question that Iranian support for Hamas and Islamic Jihad enabled an attack like this. I should also note, by the way, that Iran is not the only country that is a patron of Hamas. Qatar and Turkey both provide funding to Hamas and also provide a home for Hamas leaders who are not based in Gaza. So I think there are a number of countries at the moment who need to seriously re-examine their priorities and their support for Hamas. When it comes to the $6 billion, that money has not been released to Iran. I think it's important to note that, first of all, it's not U.S. funds; it's Iranian funds that were seized as part of sanctions. Second, those funds that had been held in South Korean banks were not released to Iran; they were moved to Qatari banks. Third, while they have not been released, if they ever are released, it is only supposed to be for humanitarian assistance that will be monitored and verified. So, at the moment there's a lot of rhetoric about the $6 billion, but given that Iran has not had any access yet to any of the $6 billion, I'm not sure that it's relevant to this discussion. There's as I've said, there's certainly a much larger discussion to be had about Iranian support for terrorist groups and for Hamas in particular. But given that the $6 billion is still frozen, I'm not sure why that's part of the discussion.
What about instability in the north, where Hezbollah has more than 100,000 rockets, over 10,000 with precision-guided capabilities on the border with Israel? There have been reports of some clashes on the northern border. How likely is it that Hezbollah enters this fight and creates a northern front?
One of the most difficult aspects of what took place on Saturday is that while Israelis were surprised and shocked that an attack like this came from Hamas, the idea of an attack like this was not a surprise, because an operation exactly like this is what has consumed Israeli security officials for nearly 10 years. But the assumption has been that it would be coming from Hezbollah in the north. Hezbollah, as opposed to Hamas, has far more rockets. Hezbollah is presumed to have about 150,000 rockets. Many of those rockets are sophisticated ones with precision guidance, as opposed to Hamas rockets, which are largely crude rockets. And those rockets, because of their sophistication, can cover the entire territory of Israel, whereas Hamas rockets, we've seen over the past few days, some can reach as far as Tel Aviv, but really not farther north than that. So Hezbollah's capability when it comes to things like rockets are much scarier and much better than Hamas's. And when we look at Israeli strikes across Syria over the past few years, and there have been hundreds of them, they've really been aimed at two things. One has been aimed at preventing Iran from establishing permanent bases in Syria across from the Israeli border along the Golan. And the second has been aimed at preventing Iran from transiting advanced weaponry through Syria into Lebanon to provide to Hezbollah. So this is something that has been on Israel's radar for a very long time. In addition to the threat of rockets, Hezbollah has something called the Radwan Force, which is dedicated to effectively breaching the border with Israel and conducting an operation along the lines of what we saw on Saturday. And Hezbollah has openly spoken about their desire to cross the border, to seize Israeli towns in the north, in the Galil, and to do similar things that we saw on Saturday as a way of demonstrating that they can strike at Israel anytime, anywhere. Just a few months ago, Hezbollah, very unusually, invited foreign press to watch a training exercise of this force, where they were literally carrying out exercises, simulating things like storming the border and taking over Israeli villages. And in fact, over the past few months, there have been a number of ways in which Hezbollah has tested Israel's northern border. A few months ago, there was a Hezbollah operative who infiltrated the border, went south into Israel, planted a roadside bomb in Megiddo, which went off. And when the IDF caught up to him and got him, they found him in a car that was packed with explosives and semi-automatic weapons. We've also seen Hezbollah over the past couple of months cross the blue line, which is the internationally recognized border between Israel and Lebanon, and pitched 2 tents on Har Dov, which is in Israeli territory. So we've seen Hezbollah test Israel's defenses in ways that indicated that they were planning for an operation like this that we saw on Saturday. Now, the great concern, of course, is that now that Hamas has done this, Hezbollah will get in on the action. And indeed, over the past couple of days, there have been some exchanges back and forth. There have been mortars shot over the Lebanese border. Today, there was an anti-tank missile shot at an Israeli army post. And Israel has responded and has killed a few Hezbollah fighters in Lebanon as well. But obviously, the name of the game at the moment, and I think in some ways this is even more pressing than Israel's military operation in Gaza, whatever that will look like, is to deter Hezbollah from opening up a northern front, given that it will be a far more challenging thing for Israel to deal with, and given that when Israel is fighting in Gaza, the IDF doesn't want to have to deal with the northern front. And I think in many ways, this is where the U.S. role becomes even more important. You noted 2 aircraft carrier strike groups that are being sent to the Eastern Mediterranean. That is being done in a clear message to Hezbollah. I think that the president yesterday, all but said it outright, that's the purpose. And Israel is also moving many reservists up north as well. So hopefully all of this will deter Hezbollah from opening up a northern front. But it's certainly not out of the question. And I think that even notwithstanding what happened in Israel's south on Saturday, this issue of a northern front is probably still the greatest worry at the moment for Israeli security officials.
Now I'm hoping we can talk about what comes next in terms of Gaza. Israel's been clear that its fight is with Hamas, not all Palestinians, and it will now continue to target Hamas in Gaza. What can we expect to see in the days and weeks ahead with an Israeli operation to rescue hostages and hold Hamas accountable, while, as it has in the past, attempting to avoid the targeting of innocent civilians? Israel's already cut off water, electricity, and food to Gaza. What comes next?
What we've seen so far, aside from cutting off supplies to Gaza, is a huge amount of Israeli airstrikes, targeting Hamas fighters, targeting Hamas strongholds, targeting spots where Israel believes material support is being provided to Hamas. That is largely what has happened in previous rounds of fighting between Israel and Hamas. There have been a couple of times where ground troops went in, most recently in 2014, and that operation lasted, I believe, 51 days, if memory serves me correctly. And I think this time, all signs point to a ground incursion coming, not only because Israel has mobilized more reserves than it ever has at any other time in its history, but because there seems to be a determination now that Hamas cannot simply be degraded, that Hamas's military capabilities have to be eliminated entirely, and potentially Hamas has to be removed from power. And it is going to be impossible to do either of those things solely with airstrikes. And so I think that a ground operation is, it's not 100% a certainty, but I think it's very close to that. And so that's likely to be the next move. Now, the issue of the hostages, of course, complicates things greatly, because when you have so many Israelis inside of Gaza, they are obviously at risk. If you stick to airstrikes, I think that we can expect that hostages will be used as human shields. Yesterday, Israeli schools and municipalities told parents that they should be taking social media off of their kids' phones in anticipation of Hamas starting to execute hostages if airstrikes continued, and putting those videos on social media. I can tell you that in my kid's school, which is a Jewish school here in suburban Maryland, a message went out issuing that same morning. So that's obviously complicated. And if Israel launches a ground invasion, that also runs the risk of Hamas executing hostages. And that does leave an option ahead of time of trying to negotiate in return for the release of these hostages. But there are a number of really complicating factors there as well. I should note there were reports on Sunday and Monday that the Egyptians and I believe the Qataris attempted to negotiate with Hamas to release wounded hostages, and they were met with no success. Now, if Israel tries to negotiate for the release of the hostages, as I said, there are a couple of complicating factors. One is that in some ways, Hamas is in this case a victim of its own terrible success. And what I mean by that is that had Hamas gone and abducted 150 Israelis and brought them back into Gaza, and then wanted to negotiate their release for the release of Hamas prisoners, it would still be difficult. But I think it's almost impossible for any Israeli leader to do that when you also have over 1,000 dead Israeli civilians literally still lying in the streets. That whether that was Hamas's intention from the beginning or they simply took the awful opportunity that came to them, I think it seems to me almost impossible that Prime Minister Netanyahu or anyone else can negotiate for hostages and let Hamas fighters out, given that you are talking about so many Israelis who were brutally killed. Second, Israel has done this most prominently before, when over 1,000 Hamas fighters in Israeli prisons were released for Gilad Shalit, who had been people I'm sure you all know was an Israeli soldier who was abducted by Hamas through one of these tunnels that I spoke about earlier and brought back into Gaza. Gilad Shalit was released in return for over 1,000 Hamas and Islamic Jihad fighters. One of the people who was released in the Gilad Shalit deal was Yahya Sinwar, who is the Hamas chief in Gaza. And it's a very stark reminder that releasing prisoners like this from Israeli jails, even if you are getting Israelis back, ultimately can lead to the deaths of even more Israelis. And I think that given what just happened, and given that it was directed and planned and executed by someone who was in Israeli prison and was released to get an Israeli back, I think that makes the situation more difficult as well. So, I think that given all of that, an Israeli ground operation probably is coming, and I'm devastated to say that the lives of the Israelis who are in Gaza, I think, are going to be at severe risk, no matter what Israel does.
We do have some government officials, congressional staff on the call. And I think it's important that we talk even further about what the U.S. can do. We outlined at the outset, you elaborated a bit on steps the Biden administration has already taken, but what comes next? What else could the Biden administration be doing? What else can Congress do to support Israel in this time? So
first of all, rhetorical support is extremely important. I think a lot of people tend to discount it, but the outpouring of emotion that I've seen directly, forget about what's been reported in the press, that I've seen directly from Israeli relatives and friends and colleagues in the aftermath of the president's talk yesterday, or the president's speech yesterday, is really remarkable. And I think that there are so many Israelis who found some small measure of comfort in the obviously heartfelt and emotional way that the president spoke about Israel and Israelis and America's dedication to Israel's safety and security. And so I think that for folks in the administration and for members of Congress, don't discount how important that is to Israelis, and it's a really critical thing to be doing in this time. Second, obviously providing Israel with whatever it needs for its security, whether that be Iron Dome interceptors or munitions, is something that is already happening, and of course should continue to happen. And as you noted, Haley, up top, it may be difficult for that to happen unless some of the chaos right now in Congress with no speaker in the House is arrested. So hopefully that situation will resolve itself as soon as possible. Third, I already mentioned the carrier groups and the importance of those for deterring Hezbollah and Iran. Keeping up anything that the U.S. can do to deter further action from Iran, and particularly in opening up another front, I think is critical. And here I want to mention that this shouldn't only be about direct American actions. I think it's also important for us to lean on American allies and American partners who may be able to impact the situation as well. It is disgraceful that Qatar and Turkey have not ended their support for Hamas. That should have happened a long time ago. Turkey is a NATO ally. Qatar was designated last year as a major non-NATO ally. I think that the United States, as I'm sure it already is, should continue to press those countries, to use the influence they have with Hamas to get the hostages out, and second, to have a real conversation about when this crisis is over, how they are going to end their material support for Hamas. Second, at the moment, there's an analysis that one of the factors that may impede Hezbollah from entering this war is that Lebanon is a failed state. Its economy is in shambles, and Hezbollah understands that any war with Israel is going to make that situation even more dire. Many Lebanese blame Hezbollah for the situation inside of Lebanon, and many people see this as a variable that may be giving Hezbollah pause. In the past, states in the region, including Saudi Arabia, have contributed to help rebuild Lebanon after hostilities initiated by Hezbollah against Israel. I think it would also be helpful in this moment if the United States presses some of its friends in the region to communicate to Hezbollah directly that if it enters the war, reconstruction assistance for Lebanon in the wake of anything that is wrought by Hezbollah will not be forthcoming. Hezbollah should not enter any hostilities with Israel with the assumption that states in the region will help it out of its problems in the aftermath, and help it escape some of the blame that it will get for Lebanon's destruction if it comes to that. So I think all of these things are important, and these are all things that the United States can and should be doing in the moment.
Okay, we're now going to move on to the audience questions, and I'm seeing them updated in real time, so feel free to still email them to info@jewishdems.org. Our first question, some have suggested that Hamas has laid a trap for Israel to draw it into a ground war that will turn into a debilitating quagmire, while also scuttling talks with Saudi Arabia, possibly significantly distancing the parties from the Abraham Accords, in the Abraham Accords from Israel, and given the likely massive civilian casualties in Gaza, over time erode global sympathy and support for Israel. How should Israel protect itself from that trap while still responding justifiably to Hamas's heinous and barbaric actions and the understandable demands of the Israeli people for an overwhelming military response?
I'm sure that that is indeed part of Hamas's calculation. We would like to draw Israel into a war in Gaza, first and foremost because Hamas does not care about Palestinian civilians. I think everybody can agree on that. And so in some ways, Hamas will, of course, not only benefit, but I think hope that Israel is going to wreak destruction in Gaza, particularly because Hamas will be the last. Hamas and its leadership will be the last people who suffer, given that they have built an entire underground city in Gaza of tunnels and bunkers, and no doubt they have plenty of supplies of food, water, fuel, and whatever else they need. So I think the premise of the question is 100% correct. I'm sure that they are looking to draw Israel into this. That said, I don't know that Israel has any good options here, but certainly any options that are better than trying to dislodge Hamas from Gaza, given what has just happened. And what that means is that if Israel does indeed go into Gaza, it certainly will have to take great care. I think everybody should be prepared. Obviously I say this with enormous gravity. I think everybody should be prepared for the fact that there will be Palestinian casualties and there will be Palestinian civilian casualties, and nobody should brush that aside or simply pass it off as necessary collateral damage. But I think it's going to be unavoidable. Israel's going to have to do what it can to take great care that it avoids that as much as possible. Part of the logic of a ground operation is indeed to do that, because were Israel to not care about civilian casualties in any way, shape, or form, it could flatten Gaza from the air. But I don't think that's going to happen, and part of it is that Israel is not going to go in and simply kill Palestinian civilians with abandon. Second, while I certainly understand Israel's move to cut off supplies to Gaza. It does seem unusual given what's going on to be supplying electricity directly to Gaza, which is what Israel does. I do think that at some point there will have to be discussions about some sort of either humanitarian corridor for supplies, or some outside party that can distribute humanitarian supplies inside of Gaza, because there are 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza, and they are going to suffer the brunt of this as a result of Hamas initiating this war. But they shouldn't be simply left aside. So, I agree that in many ways this is a trap designed to draw Israel in. I think Israel understands that and is going to be going into this with eyes wide open, and whatever it can do to mitigate that trap, it should be doing. When it comes to the normalization aspect of this, I've written and spoken a lot over the past year about how Israel-Saudi normalization is a matter of when, it's not a matter of if. And I think that's still the case. But when we talk about the when, I think that the timeline for that, is now significantly pushed into the future. I don't know that it was anything but a long shot that a normalization agreement would be concluded in the next 6 to 12 months. But if it was a long shot before, at this point, it seems like a virtual impossibility. And I want to take this opportunity to note that many folks have spoken over the past 3 years about normalization as if it was a way around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as if the Abraham Accords, or as if normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia would be a way of making the Israeli-Palestinian conflict irrelevant. And I think that we're seeing now that that simply cannot be done. It cannot be done because even if there had been a normalization agreement signed with Saudi Arabia last week before this happened, it would not have forestalled what took place on Saturday. And we're unfortunately going to be seeing the way in which violence in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict does indeed impact states in the region's calculations when it comes to normalization with Israel. So normalization is a fantastic development. It should continue. I hope it does. But I think that anybody who supports normalization, as I hope everybody on this call does, should also understand in the aftermath of this that normalization is wonderful, but it is not a substitute for addressing Israeli-Palestinian issues. And unfortunately, now we are going to see in real time how Israeli-Palestinian issues are going to put a damper on normalization.
Our next audience question: has there been any attempt, and we know this will take time, to understand how military intelligence was so incorrect or simply wrong? And And I would add to that, the last time you spoke to JDCA, Michael, you spoke alongside Amir Tibon, a remarkable journalist for Haaretz, who on Saturday, and he's written about this and spoken about it, he was hiding with his family in a safe room in southern Israel for 10 hours until his father, a retired IDF general, came to rescue them. As Amir himself has questioned, how is it possible that it took so long for the IDF to respond as the horror unfolded in southern Israel? Where was the breakdown, and what can be done to ensure this never happens again? So it's a few parts there. The first part is how the intelligence got this wrong, what took so long, and how can Israel ensure this never happens again?
So first of all, let me just say that not to ever make this about me, because thankfully I spent Saturday and Sunday in the safety of my home. But one of a few of the most awful hours I've recently had were when I saw that my frantic WhatsApp to Amir went unread. Knowing where he lives and where he was. So I should say that I'm just I've been in touch with Amir directly, so he knows. But I'm so thankful and gratified that he came through the safe and sound, as did his wife Miri and their two daughters. So we'll start with the intel failure. I think there are two potential aspects to this. One potential aspect is that Israel simply missed what was going on entirely. There have been reports over the past couple of days about the great lengths to which Hamas went to when communicating and planning this event, to do it all completely low tech, no phones, no communications of electronic communications of any sort. Just having face-to-face conversations, putting things down on pen and paper, all as a way of avoiding Israel's high-tech intelligence capabilities. There have also been reports that Egyptian intelligence warned Israel a week ago that something big was being planned. So it's possible that Israel just missed this entirely and did not know what was going on. Another possibility, and I should say that these things are not mutually exclusive, is that Israel saw what was going on but misinterpreted it. There were riots along the Gaza fence for 2 weeks before this, and those riots were largely seen as an effort by Hamas to get Israel to reopen the Erez crossing for people and the Kerem Shalom crossing for goods, and an effort to get Qatar to up the amount of money that it has been providing to Gaza for needy families. And that fit into the mistaken conception that I noted up top, held by many folks, again including me, that Hamas was interested in economic concessions and that they had a real interest in actually figuring out how to rule and administer Gaza. In hindsight, those riots along the fence were not about any sort of economic concessions. They were literally a dry run for what happened on Saturday. So I think it's possible that some of this is Israel seeing what was going on and seeing the wrong thing, and some of this may be that they absolutely had no wind of it. But as you know, this isn't just about an intelligence failure; it's also about an operational failure. And in some ways, I think the operational failure is and should be more concerning. So on the one hand, Israel's deployment of troops around the Gaza border was woefully inadequate. Some of that has to do with what I mentioned earlier, which was this reliance on a high tech fence and a determination that because of all the technology and advanced technology being deployed, that Israel would know about any incursion ahead of time. Second is that this Israeli government's priorities in particular, but previous Israeli governments as well, have been the West Bank. Before Saturday, something between 70 and 80% of the active duty IDF was stationed inside of the West Bank. About 5 hours after the attack happened on Saturday, you had 7 battalions, after they'd been moved, you had 7 battalions that were moved down and were fighting in the south and on the border with Gaza, and you had 23 battalions that were still in the West Bank. Last week, Tzvi Sukkot, who is a member of Knesset from Hatzianut Hadatit, religious Zionism, Bezalel Smotrich's party. Tzvi Sukkot went into the town of Hawara last Friday, a Palestinian town that I think everybody probably is now familiar with, given the attack against 2 Israelis who were shot and killed in Hawara back in February. Tzvi Sukkot went into Hawara, set up a sukkah in the middle of the town, and he and 100 of his friends had a giant sing-along right in the main drag of Hawara, and the IDF had to rush a company of soldiers to Hawara to protect these Israelis who decided that they wanted to have a holiday celebration right in the middle of the main street running through a Palestinian town. When your priorities are to expand settlements inside the West Bank, and that means that you have to expend an enormous amount of manpower protecting the people who live there. And particularly when you're talking about settlements that are deep inside the West Bank, I'm not talking about the settlements that are the large settlement blocks on the Green Line. That is not where the IDF is mainly deployed. It's deployed much deeper into the West Bank to protect the isolated pockets of Israelis. And so, without question, this is a failure of deployment. And I think that Israeli policy needs to be seriously rethought. And anyone who still believes that settlements improve Israeli security as opposed to being a burden on Israeli security, I think should take a hard look at the facts and a hard look at what's going on. Second, the IDF seems to have been caught in this emergency, not quite sure how to respond. It took a long time for soldiers to be moved to the south. There are also all sorts of reports coming out about lack of equipment. Many people on this call will have seen the various fundraising calls that have gone out, largely through the American Jewish Federation system, but through other groups as well, including I've seen lots of GoFundMe campaigns to buy Israeli soldiers things like helmets and bulletproof vests and boots, basic equipment. Not buy an Israeli soldier a hot meal or buy an Israeli soldier a phone charger, but buy an Israeli soldier the equipment that is absolutely necessary to fight and to protect Israelis. And so, I think that when this fighting is over, Israeli government officials and the IDF certainly are going to have to look at things like deployment, at things like their responses in real time, and at spending priorities, because it's simply unfathomable to me that it's now American Jews who are buying basic military equipment for Israelis, equipment that I think should have been provided by the government of Israel.
There have been questions. There is a question about exactly that. So the human cost is enormous and mounting. How can we support humanitarian efforts? This question talks about Amazon lists that's been sent by relatives, including medical supplies needed by IDF units. Specifically, they're asking, is it legal to send medical supplies? How should people approach the GoFundMe requests? And then the next part is, how can people find out whether a group asking for donations for the IDF is a legal nonprofit?
So those are questions that are beyond my scope of expertise. Unfortunately, I would say as a general rule, the various federations have all established emergency funds for Israel, and 100% of those funds are going directly to Israel. Obviously, federations are all recognized nonprofits completely above board. So I would say first and foremost, for anyone who has concerns about whether the places they're donating are legitimate, or whether the funds that they're donating will actually get to where they have to be, do it through well-established organizations, and I would say that the federations are at the top of that list. The federations, of course, are not the only group. There are plenty of other established groups as well. But to me, that seems to be a very safe and worthy bet.
Great. Our next question touches on the first question that we asked about the breaking news of a unity government. With Benny Gantz joining a coalition government, is the current cabinet capable of dealing with this crisis? And what does it mean that hardliners still remain in the cabinet?
So, because the prosecution of the war, is going to be left to this very narrow war cabinet. Whatever you think of Prime Minister Netanyahu, he has been prime minister now, with the exception of a year and a half, continuously since 2009. He certainly has lots of experience with military issues, and certainly there are going to be questions about his motivations, but no question that he has plenty of experience. Yoav Gallant is the defense minister, and was a former head of Southern Command, and was a candidate to be IDF chief of staff. Certainly he has military experience as well. And Benny Gantz, of course, is a former IDF chief of staff and a former defense minister. So the people who are overseeing the war have as much experience as one would hope and expect. The rest of the Israeli cabinet obviously has some folks who are in positions that certainly I believe they are grossly unqualified for and shouldn't be in them. Bezalel Smotrich is a minister in the defense ministry, despite not having any significant military experience. Itamar Ben-Gvir is the national security minister, despite having been deemed so radical at the age of 18 that he was not even eligible to be drafted into the IDF. He does not have 1 day of military service or experience. And where I am concerned is not about the war cabinet that is going to oversee military operations. Where I'm concerned is that Itamar Ben-Gvir, as national security minister, still oversees the Israel police. And if things escalate into East Jerusalem, and yesterday there were 2 Palestinians who shot fireworks at soldiers in Silwan and were shot and killed in response. If things escalate in East Jerusalem, that will be the police under Itamar Ben-Gvir's purview, who are sort of the front line in terms of responding. And if we see perhaps the worst case scenario, which is fighting extending to mixed cities in Israel, like we saw in May 2021, that will also be largely under the purview of the police, who are led by Itamar Ben-Gvir. And so I think that we should be comforted that there is now a national unity government, and that the military fighting in Gaza and what hopefully will not, but might extend to the north, will be overseen not by the cabinet as it was, but by a much more experienced and smaller group of people. But that doesn't mean that the folks who are still in the Israeli government don't have important positions and roles that may be brought to bear. And I think all of the concerns about Israel's government before, when it comes to experience and when it comes to decision making and when it comes to judgment, those remain in place, because the country still has to be run. Even though the Knesset will not be passing new legislation, there's still a country to run, and everything doesn't magically stop because there's fighting going on. So I certainly remain concerned about this government, and I think others should as well.
Okay, well, I'm just going to warn you. This will be our final question, but it is the hardest one. It's been a very dark 5 days, and it's hard to find bright spots in the days, weeks, and months ahead. What, if anything, gives you hope? What are you looking to as the path forward here that will bring us back to and ideally a better place in the future?
One of the things that gives me hope is that before Saturday, Israeli society was polarized and divided in an unprecedented fashion. We've talked about these issues. We've talked about these issues before, and everybody here understands them. So no need to go into what's gone on over the past 10 months. And as soon as this horrible tragedy unfolded, we saw Israeli society almost magically heal itself, at least for the short term. The reservists who had said they were not going to show up for reserve duty all showed up. Literally, there are numbers floating around, that 110% or 150% of reservists have showed up, meaning that ones who were not even called up, who were not even eligible to be called up, have shown up and reported to their units. The leaders of the various protest groups who have spent 10 months protesting the government have overnight transformed their organizations into ones that are mobilizing and collecting supplies. People should see the video from Kikar Dizengoff Square, which on Yom Kippur was the scene of awful clashes between two groups of Israelis, and now had been transformed overnight into a humanitarian supply collection facility. Israelis have really come together, and I think that everybody was afraid about what the past 10 months would do to Israeli society, but it's so encouraging to see Israelis putting all that aside for the greater good. Second, some of the stories that have come out since Saturday and Sunday, of course, are horrific, but some of them are incredibly inspiring. We've already mentioned Amir Tibon, but if you haven't read his story or watched his story, it's obviously important in terms of what he went through, but the heroism of his father, Noam Tibon, literally driving down from Tel Aviv with nothing but a pistol, because he's a retired general, not an active duty general, to save his family is just incredible. Yair Golan, who was a former deputy chief of staff of the IDF, and someone who has come under a lot of criticism over the past couple of years since he's entered politics. Literally families were calling him up and saying, here are the coordinates of a family member who's hiding. The military's not there, and he literally went and rescued people single-handedly just because somebody sent him their location. There's stories like this all over the place, and amidst all the tragedy and the ugliness and just the brutality, some of it unimaginable, there are rays of light, and people should, as much as there's a temptation to doom scroll, people should seek out these stories, seek out the light, because it's really important in a time like this, and hopefully provides not only emotional support, but perhaps a path for how Israel can move forward when this is all said and done.
Thank you so much, Michael. We really appreciate you sharing your insight, your expertise with us today. Thank you. I would also encourage everyone to read Michael's column every week. This week, The Shattering, and we feel that as well. I'd now like to call on a Senior Director for Programming and Public Engagement at JDCA, Bobby Saferstein, to conclude our program.
Thank you, Haley. The world woke up this past Saturday on Shemini Atzeret to learn of an unprecedented surprise assault by the terrorist group Hamas on Israel, and the unspeakable brutality exacted on innocent civilians, men, women, children, babies, and the elderly. With Israelis, Americans, and other foreign nationals being among the victims and hostages, we condemn the heinous and barbaric acts perpetrated by Hamas and the entirely unnecessary loss of life and human suffering of innocent Israelis and Palestinians alike as a result of Hamas's actions. Our Jewish tradition teaches us not to fall into despair. Times like this call for community and action, and we are grateful to each of you for being in community and taking collective action with us at JDCA. Please visit jewishdems.org, where we invite you to, 1, sign up to our email list to learn about upcoming briefings like this, including the next edition of our Crisis in Israel series next Wednesday, October 18th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, so please save the date. 2, please sign on to our calls to action urging the Senate to confirm Jack Lew to be our next ambassador to Israel so that he can begin his important work in the region. 3, please join one of JDCA's state and local chapters and affiliates made up of passionate grassroots volunteers like yourself. And 4, please become a JDCA member to gain access to exclusive briefings throughout the year. Later today at 5 p.m. Eastern, we also invite you to join Jewish Women for Joe for a special program on the crisis in Israel with First Lady Dr. Jill Biden and Congresswoman Alyssa Slotkin. They will be discussing the crisis in Israel in depth. The link to sign up is in the chat. As the crisis continues to develop, JDCA is monitoring the situation, and we will keep you informed as things unfold. To close out today's program, I invite you to join me as we first mourn all those lost by saying Baruch Dayan Ha'emet. 2, pray for the speedy and safe return of the hostages. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam matir asurim. And 3, pray for peace. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu ya'aseh shalom, aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'al kol yoshvei tevel v'imru amen. May the one who creates peace bring peace to us, to Israel, and to all who dwell on earth. Amen. Thank you for joining us. Stay strong, and we'll see you soon.